Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I wanted to talk to you guys today about a concept in astrology called translation of light. This is an important, very detail oriented part of elections and astrological charts in general that can help you understand the interaction between not just planets, but also between the topics they rule. So you might recall that in a previous video, maybe just like 2 videos ago, I did a treatment of relationship elections where we're looking at the relationship between the ruler of the first house. So, for example, in Cancer rising, the moon, and the ruler of the seventh house in Cancer rising, Saturn, because Capricorn rules the seventh in a Cancer rising chart. So, in such a chart, we would be looking at the relationship between the ruler of the first and the ruler of the seventh to understand the dynamic in interpersonal relationships that are one-on-one in nature. So, for example, in contracts or proposals or anything that involves direct communication and agreement or compromise with one other person. That could also go for like an agreement between two groups if it's two organizations that are making an agreement. The first and the seventh houses would be the group or person initiating the proposal, and the seventh is the one receiving it and deciding whether to go with it. So in a similar way that we can observe the relationship between the first and the seventh house in any election that concerns relationships, we can also do the same thing for any other topic. We can look at the rulers of certain topics, multiple topics in a chart, and see how those rulers are interacting. So that's step one, is just understanding that in the same way as that first seventh house dynamic, we could also look at, for example, the relationship between the rulers of the fifth house and the eighth house. For example, is there a parent who's applying for financial aid for their child? So that would involve the fifth house and the eighth house. I just did an election for somebody's FAFSA application. So that's been on my mind. How can I find a chart where the fifth house is in favorable relationship with the eighth house based on the rulers of those houses and how those are interacting? So figured this probably is a little bit heady at the moment because it's difficult to visualize just in your head. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at some charts where we can explore this concept, not only the concept of house topics and how they interact, but also specifically this notion of translation of light, which I'll get into more. So I'm just going to go to, actually, I really liked that chart. I should not have clicked now. Let's go back to that one. So that was a nice chart where Jupiter was on the ascendant. And let's take a look at this from the perspective of looking at this as actually, yeah, let's go back to a Sag rising chart. Let's go back. Remember, earlier I had been talking about relationship elections where either Jupiter or Mercury was ruling the ascendant. And when Mercury was earlier in Libra, I was noting that in any Mercury or Jupiter ruled chart, the other planet, like whichever one's not ruling the ascendant, Mercury or Jupiter, is going to be ruling the seventh house. And so the trine, at that time, it was a trine that was coming into formation between Mercury and Jupiter that indicated accord and harmony and getting along between the two parties involved. But what we notice now in this Sagittarius rising chart is that rather than moving toward each other quickly, so we have Mercury moving direct and Jupiter moving retrograde, now they're actually moving apart from each other. So that trine is separating, becoming wider in orb from both directions. Mercury is moving forward and Jupiter is moving backwards. So this trine that already occurred is getting wider in both directions. And because of this, on the face of it is problematic from the perspective of a relationship election, because in this case now, instead of harmony and accord between two parties that is increasing in strength and these parties are coming together, we see that these parties are growing apart. And this is something that I would, raise my eyebrows at if I was looking for an election. Yes, I like that they have a trine, but what about the fact that they're moving apart from each other? That doesn't sound like a recipe for success if we're looking to make an agreement. However, there is this special thing that can happen where another body, something other than Mercury or Jupiter, swoops in to make the connection for them. Most commonly, the planet that can do this is Mercury or the moon, because those are the two planets that are most likely to be moving the fastest. So a planet that translates light is likely to be the moon, and sometimes it's Mercury. And what we see here in this chart is that the moon is at 20 degrees of Aries, making an aspect by degree to both Mercury by opposition and to Jupiter. And so what's special about this moon is that it is going to aspect Jupiter and carry the light of Jupiter to Mercury. So in this case, there's an intermediary between Jupiter and Mercury that is helping them communicate and drawing them closer together. So rather than simply growing apart, as indicated by the separation, this is a case where the moon or where the trine between Mercury and Jupiter is being reinforced by the moon. And so this is something that you want to look for in cases where there is a separating aspect between topics that are important, because if there's translation between those topics, that indicates success, depending on the nature of the aspects and the planets involved. For example, if we were looking to what's a good example? Okay, so let's go back a day prior, maybe two. Yeah, okay, so this is a good example where we can go to, let's see, let's go to a Capricorn. No. Fiddle around with this for a little bit. Yeah, so let's just stick Venus on the ascendant and see what kind of chart we get. So we do get, this is a chart that I would, there's a lot wrong with this chart, but I'm just going to talk about it as an example. And we can practice this technique of looking at the rulers of houses, how those are related, and so on. So we have a Scorpio rising chart. The ruler of the ascendant is Mars and Libra in the 12th. So it's in detriment. This is a day chart because the sun's above the horizon. So Mars is also out of sect in the 12th. So this is certainly not a chart that I would advise using, and that's only the beginning of why I would not advise using it. But there is a benefic on the ascendant, so maybe, and there's also the other benefic, Jupiter is on the IC. So let's consider this chart in terms of property. Let's say that you are looking to make a deal for a property. So whether that's leasing something or making a purchase of a property, Jupiter is on the IC here. So maybe the property looks like pretty good, and you're definitely interested in pulling the trigger, so to speak, with Mars ruling the ascendant. But maybe the trigger, you're a little trigger shy, right? Because it's Mars in detriment. So that leap into action is going to be challenged by deliberation and consideration and weighing the options, right? So the one of the challenges here is going to be following your gut and following your instinct. Are you getting too much in your head about it? Are there maybe other kinds of anxieties that you're having that are not super connected to the property itself, but are more like symbolic in nature, more Venusian? And so we can see here, let's take a look at what the moon's doing. So the moon here is in Aries. It's in an opposition with Mars. And so just take a moment and consider, is the moon getting closer to or further away from Mars as we move through time? So the moon is faster than Mars, right? So that means that the moon already opposed Mars. It's at 6, Mars is at 4 degrees. So it's moved past Mars already. And then what is its next degree-based aspect classically? So its next aspect is actually going to be Saturn. So we see here that the moon is passing light, translating light from Mars, the ruler of the ascendant, to Saturn. And what houses does Saturn rule? It's ruling the 4th. So Mars is being connected to Saturn And this is a little bit different from the previous example where we were looking at Mercury and Jupiter, because in that example, Mercury and Jupiter were separating already, and then the moon was coming in to make a connection happen that was waning in strength. So fortifying something that was becoming less strong. In this case, look at the trine between Mars and Saturn and consider what direction the planets are moving in relative to each other. So we have Mars at 4 degrees of Libra moving direct. It's moving forward in degrees. And then we have Saturn at 7 degrees of Aquarius, and it's retrograde. So it's moving backwards in degrees. So we have Mars at 4 going forward. So it's going to go like 4, 5, 6. And then Saturn moving backwards at 7. So it's going to go 7, 6, 5. So with that, we can see that the planets are moving into contact already. They are mutually applying. So we have this coming together already of the ruler of the first and the ruler of the fourth. But in addition to that, we have the moon making that connection even stronger. And so this is a chart where that connection between the first house and the fourth house, this is a property-based election where we're signing a lease or something like that. This is a chart where the ruler of the first and the ruler of the fourth are extremely connected, showing that something is definitely happening. Now, is it good? Is this a good opportunity? Is this something that's going to work out well? I'm guessing probably not. Probably because of something with respect to the person initiating this. This individual, whoever is doing this, doesn't look like they're in a good state of mind to be carrying out this action with respect to like signing a lease or something, because it's an out of sect malefic in detriment that is ruling the ascendant. So the individual themselves is not in a position to be successful here. Now, what this could be a little bit better for, maybe, the moon is between malefics, and there's a kind of harshness to that. So that aspect between the moon and Saturn and Mars could indicate like a lot of home improvements. Like, malefics tear things down, and so in terms of tearing down a building or just doing something that's intentionally destructive, this could be an election that's good for that, because the moon is, it's opposing Mars and another aspect to Saturn. So these destructive influences are very much shaping the nature of this action. So this is another example of translation of light. This is not an example of an aspect that's separating where the translation mitigates that, but rather one where they are mutually applying, and that connection between Mars and Saturn is being fortified. In general, a trine between the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the fourth is positive, but because of the condition of Mars being in the 12th and in detriment in a day chart, that translation from Mars to Saturn is not helping Saturn. Saturn is, looking at this Mars by trine, and so there's not a whole lot of tension or conflict per se, but Mars is bringing an intemperate heat to Saturn that might kind of rub Saturn the wrong way, or the structure that Saturn provides is going to be weakened or at least aggravated by this Mars. And so it's better to put this to use for taking down a structure, or perhaps because these are in air signs, for deconstructing an idea, perhaps a psychological, self-identifying, unhelpful concept that you need to like rid yourself of in order for psychological healing. We have malefics here in the 4th and the 12th, which are both rather private, intimate places. And so in terms of that destruction, we can think about this in terms of a building, right? But what about your house, like your house, your temple, your body, and the mind that you carry within it? having these malefics in air signs in these particular houses is indicating some level of challenge in those areas, but it could be productive even though it's difficult, right? And we see this as well with just the moon opposing Mars. Moon Mars aspects tend to be really taxing, both physically and psychologically, more so physically, but in these particular houses, there's definitely a strong psychological influence here. So this is an election that you're not going to use for most things, but it's one that could be useful in these specific cases. And we see here the translation of light kind of solidifying those themes between the first and the fourth houses, because those are the houses that are ruled by Mars and Saturn. So that is one example. Let's head forward to a more positive election. I'm going to go to a nice little pocket here where the moon is between benefics. So this is going to be another example of a chart where we have a mutual application of planets. And the planets that are mutually applying here, I'll put it to you. Which planets in this chart are applying to each other? There are multiple correct answers here. And I think there's 3 correct answers here. Well, yes. No, there's 4 correct answers in this particular chart, this Virgo rising. So one of them, and if you haven't found all of them yet, just pause the video and find the 4. And by the way, I'm only looking at traditional planets here. So why don't I just eliminate the outers for simplicity's sake and for ease of calculation for you. So we have, if you haven't found all 4 pairs, pause the video, or if you just want to enjoy the show, the planets that are mutually applying, in other words, one is moving forward and one is moving backwards. We have number 1, Venus is applying to Jupiter and Jupiter is applying to Venus, because we have Venus moving direct into the square with Jupiter and Jupiter moving retrograde into the square with Venus. Similarly, we have the same thing happening between the moon and Jupiter, where the moon is applying to Jupiter and Jupiter is applying to the moon. We also have Mars applying to Saturn and Saturn applying to Mars. And the same is true of the sun. The sun is applying to Saturn and Saturn is applying to the sun. If you said the sun and Mars, you would be incorrect, but only barely. So here the sun is applying to Mars and Mars is kind of like scooting away from the sun slightly. So the sun is moving faster than Mars, but only barely. And so they're kind of like moving together and they're moving toward a conjunction, but Mars is kind of scooting away very slowly. And it's like trying to get away, but it can't quite keep up. And the sun is a little bit faster. So the sun's going to conjoin it, but Mars is not applying to the sun, right? The sun is applying to Mars and Mars is just kind of moving forward still. So if Mars were moving backward, which is not astronomically possible in this situation, then they would be mutually applying. But if we went to what's a good example? Like October 30th of 2020. I think this is a case where the sun, okay, not quite. Yeah, but it will be. So if we look at the Libra sun last year relative to Mars, this is a case where Mars is retrograde and the sun is direct. And so they're moving into an aspect with each other, right? So Mars is moving lower in degrees in Aries and the sun is moving higher in degrees in Libra. So they will meet an aspect around, I don't know when exactly they'll complete the aspect, maybe like in the early 20s or something. So, I think I'm going to have trouble finding that chart that I was just looking at. Oh, well. Oh, no, there it is. Lovely. Okay, so all of that stuff about mutual applications. So here, the moon is between benefics. It's between an opposition with Venus and a square with Jupiter. And so number 1, that's good. This is an exalted moon. We like that. and we like the moon to be aspecting benefics. What we want to look at is, yes, it's Venus and Jupiter, and that's good, but what is it that Venus and Jupiter are signifying in the chart? And therefore, between what topics is the moon strengthening the connection? So take a moment and consider, which houses do Venus and Jupiter rule? Okay, so we've got Jupiter. Jupiter rules the 7th, Pisces, and the 4th, Sag, right? And then we've got Venus. Venus rules the 9th, Taurus, and the 2nd, Libra. So this aspect that the moon is fortifying between Venus and Jupiter is an aspect that favorably unites some combination of the 7th and the 4th, along with some combination of the 2nd and the 7th, or the 2nd and the 9th. So what could that mean? So if we're looking at it in terms of the 2nd house rulership of Venus and say the 7th house rulership of Jupiter, the moon is passing light from the ruler of the 2nd, personal finances, income, possessions, to the ruler of the 7th. And so what is an example of a situation where the 2nd house is being given to the 7th house? It's being passed on to the 7th house. Maybe something to do with giving somebody a gift, or giving somebody money, right? And it's gonna be received well, right? As you know, you have this Jupiter in the 6th in a night chart with Saturn. It does have this aspect from Venus, but in general, this Jupiter is struggling a little bit. Specifically because of the 6th house placement. I mean, Saturn definitely doesn't help, but you know, if this were a Saturn that was angular, or excuse me, if this were a Jupiter that were angular or something, I might be a little bit more optimistic about the condition of the 7th house person. But if they're in the 6th, maybe they're ill, maybe they just had an accident, maybe something's wrong, you know. Maybe they're overworked and or injured or something like that. So this Jupiter, you know, it's Jupiter, so it's trying to look on the bright side of things, right? But it is severely inhibited because of where it happens to find itself. It happens to find itself accidentally in the 6th house, which makes it difficult to, you know, just get on with life. It makes it difficult to find optimism when you have Jupiter in the 6th, right? And so the 7th house person, this other party that's being involved here, is you know, definitely somebody who could use some help. And so this aspect from the ruler that's being passed by the moon from the ruler of the 2nd to the ruler of the 7th, it's showing that this person is receiving help from the individual's possessions. And what's interesting as well is that we have the ruler of the ascendant, so like the gift giver or the money loaner or something. That person is this Mercury that's in the 2nd. So the individual themselves is doing something related to the 2nd house, related to their possessions. And this Venus, the ruler of the 2nd house, so signifying the possessions themselves, is moving into an aspect with Jupiter, the ruler of the 7th. And so all of this together definitely indicates some kind of, you know, movement of resource, whether that's, you know, time is usually more of like an 8th house resource, but certainly money or a gift of some kind. Now these are hard aspects, right? So we definitely want to take into account that all of these, you know, this translation is happening in a T-square. It's like Venus squaring Jupiter and the moon squaring Jupiter and the moon opposing Venus. So there's definitely some level of discomfort with the situation, but they're still benefics. And so that discomfort is, you know, certainly part of the context, but in general, it's still leaning toward a more positive manifestation, or at least a positive outcome. It's like receiving help like a very helpful person who kind of rubs you the wrong way, but they're still helping you, right? Like that's the kind of vibe of aspects, the hard aspects from benefics. So similarly, we could do the same kind of mental math of the second and the seventh coming into this this combination with the other houses that Venus and Jupiter rule. We could do this with the ninth and the fourth, right? Especially since the moon is in the ninth, right? Like the moon is going to co-signify the entire election as a whole. And so the moon being in the ninth, you know, we're definitely pulled in the direction of either higher learning or foreign travel, you know, going to school or maybe publishing something. So anything related to that alongside the ruler of the fourth. And so when I think of ninth, fourth house combinations, so just to be super clear, Jupiter rules the fourth, Venus rules the ninth, the moon is in the ninth, passing light from the ruler of the fourth to the ruler of the ninth. And so what does it mean for the fourth house to be moving toward the ninth house? Could you be moving abroad? Or could you be putting in an application to a university that is going to require you to move to that new location where the university is? Those are examples of elections that would be really well suited to this. And you know, at the same time, you do have the ruler of the ascendant in the second house, so there's definitely going to be a you know, a financial undertone of this, where money is definitely very much involved. So, for example, if you're applying to you know, a graduate program that has, you know, a lot of investments that you have to make, or that is, you know, in order to advance your second house status to make money in the long run. Those are things that are indicated by a ascendant ruler in the second house. So you see how we can use this this way of looking at aspects not only as indicating vibes in general, like, oh, the moon is between benefics, right? Like we like to see the moon being between benefics, but specifically, what does that mean at the level of topics and at the level of concrete manifestations? It's one thing to have good vibes, and it's one thing to have good vibes that are fourth and ninth house good vibes, right? So this is how we need to read specifically elections, but I will add, this is incredibly relevant for natal charts as well. And so if you can practice looking at charts in this way, your level of specificity in your readings is going to be massively improved, because you will not only be talking about you will not only be talking about how stuff feels or psychological dynamics, which are a little bit ephemeral, and I find, and they can definitely resonate, but it's one of those like higher level kind of philosophical spaces when you're in a reading, where you're just kind of seeing what lands, and how somebody is receiving that information and how much of it is true, and you're sort of like learning about what they're going through. And then you have this concrete manifestation where, you know, this person lives in a foreign country. Their moon is in the ninth house, and it's creating an aspect between the ruler of the ninth and the ruler of the fourth, you know? And that can really help with predictive stuff. And it can also help for just identifying where certain life circumstances are coming from. And as a result, at what times those circumstances and situations are going to be influenced by other timing techniques, like transits, like perfections. So for example, say this is a birth chart. What do you think is going to happen when Jupiter transits the moon? When Jupiter transits the moon of this nativity? It's probably going to be something about that configuration, something about the fourth and the ninth. Maybe there's another move, or maybe this person gets into an education program, or maybe they travel and are a little bit uprooted for a little bit, Like, for example, I'm thinking of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction that will happen in these later degrees of Taurus in a few years. So, Jupiter's in Uranus will still be in Taurus at that time, but Jupiter's currently in Aquarius, moving into Pisces and then Aries. And then when it's in Taurus, it will conjoin Jupiter in late Taurus. So this moon is going to get a Jupiter-Uranus transit. And because this whole configuration between the moon, Jupiter, and Venus involves those topics of the 4th and the 9th, we can expect that transit to bring something good, something Jupiterian, something expansive, but also something disruptive. So like moving, for example, something Uranian, right, to the moon. And so at a predictive level, it helps us to understand these configurations, because when we know what circumstances exist in a configuration, it enables us to predict things with respect to those situations, right? And so I hope that this is making your brain fire in special ways and helping you see charts differently, because it certainly has for me. I've been, learning electional and horary has massively improved my natal delineation skills over the years. And I hope that it does the same thing for you, because electional is so topical. It's so circumstantial, situationally based, that you have to think specifically. It's not enough to think, what does this feel like? No, we have to look at topics. And natal charts are the same. And you can certainly read natal charts in the same way. At the same time, it is good to leave a little bit more flexibility in natal charts, I find. And you can kind of scale up or scale down between like more general statements and more specific statements with a natal chart, in ways that I think you don't, in ways that are less helpful for elections and horaries. So those are just some things for you to consider. I hope that you've learned what translation of light is, how it operates in charts, and also this all this other stuff that I've kind of rambled on about. Let me know if you have any questions, as always, and look forward to the next time that we chat. Bye.